Great.
Oops. Our YouTube is flipped the wrong direction. 1 second. There we go. You're welcome to start giving hellos.
Oh, sweet. Hi, everybody. So we're just gonna keep setting this up and give everybody a few more minutes to join, and then we will get started on common bird myths. I'm very excited about this topic today. I think there are so many things out there that people have misconceptions about when it comes to birds. So exploring those and going into them a little bit more and debunking them, I think is going to be super exciting. So yeah, first live stream of 2024 for this wintertime. I'm excited. Good?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie. You guys may have seen me on the Alaska Raptor Center's page. Today, we are going to be doing a awesome topic for our first live stream of 2024. So we're going to be debunking common bird misconceptions. So I'm sure over the years growing up, recently maybe you've heard just some different little tidbits about birds here and there that you wondered if they were true or not. There are some really major ones out there, and then I also kind of took into account some other ones that you might not have heard before, and we're going to talk about maybe where they originated from, debunking them, and giving you more of a true answer here. So again, welcome in. I'm Sophie. I'm one of the avian care specialists. I'm sure you guys have seen some of my videos here or there on the Raptor Center page, but I'm excited to be here. And like I said, this is our first 2024 live stream. So welcome in if you guys are viewing. I think we're kind of streaming this on a few different platforms. We got YouTube, Facebook, maybe possibly TikTok. Yeah, so cool, awesome. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. So again, most common bird misconceptions. Like I said before, there are so many that we could cover today, but of course we are limited on time. So I picked some of my favorites, some that I have heard over the years from different tourists coming in, that I have been asked personally, or my coworkers have been asked. I kind of gathered everybody up here at the Raptor Center and I was like, hey, what are some of the most common bird misconceptions that you guys hear? And I made a list and went through it. And so we'll start off, I think, with the first one, which is, I think, probably the oldest one that I've heard. I've had, before I started working with birds myself, I think I also had this misconception or this myth in my mind that if you touch a baby bird, the mother will not care for it. So this is incorrect in a few different ways. So I don't really know where this originally came from. A lot of the myths that I'm going to be talking about today, I have tried to find where they originated, and most of them don't really have a direct answer. And so I can only assume through word of mouth, as you know, history works, stories being passed from one person to another. But in general, it's really important to know that if you do find a baby bird, let's say it's a tiny little nestling with absolutely no feathers on it, and you look up or you look down on the sidewalk and it's just sitting there, and you don't know what to do. But you have this idea in your mind, you heard somewhere at some point that I cannot touch it because if the mom smells my, the finger oils on it, it's going to reject it. First of all, most birds don't have any sort of olfactory senses, so don't have to worry about that. They really don't rely on smell at all. They are mostly visual and hearing. But for the most part, if you see this baby bird and you look up and you're like, oh, I see the nest and I see mom and dad, but the baby's down here, that mom is not going to be able to pick up that baby bird and put it back in the nest. Will she still feed it if it's on the ground? Yes, but of course it is really at risk from predation, from humans, from a lot of different, risks if it's on the ground. So we want to pick it up and we want to put it back in the nest. So all you have to do is, because of avian influenza, I would recommend, if you can, maybe not touch it with your bare hands. I think that's probably smart. But if you have no choice, then that's okay. If you take a cloth or something like that, that also works. But just literally scoop up that baby bird and put it back in the nest. If that nest is still intact, that is a wonderful option. And that way you're getting that baby back to where it needs to be. The mom is not going to reject it. She's not going to say, oh my God, this human touched it and now I can no longer take care of it. Of course, there are some cases where the bird, the mom, if that baby is sick or, you know, something like that. Oh, 1 second. Sorry, guys. Oh, that's not it. I'm just going to close this off. Sorry, guys. 1 second. Technical difficulties. Okay. Anyway, there are some cases where, you know, something that you cannot visually see, if that baby is sick or something, the mom might discontinue taking care of it. But for the most part, if you see a baby bird on the ground and you see the nest and you see that it's intact and that mom and dad are present, you can, and that bird does not physically look like it has anything going on, if it's not bleeding, if it's not apparently bruised or anything like that, just pick up the baby and put it back in the nest and you are good. It's the same thing with squirrels. I've also heard this pretty commonly with squirrels. But in reality, the squirrel mom will continue taking care of her babies, because that is her number one concern, is to keep those babies alive and well. All right, so myth number two, I have found a baby bird, but I can't interfere with it because it's illegal. So this one is a little bit more complicated. Of course, birds are very heavily protected by multiple different pieces of protective legislation out there. So the number one that comes to my mind is the Migratory Bird Act, which essentially protects all birds, songbirds, waterfowl, any sort of bird, it protects it. And this basically says, in a very simplified way, that you cannot take any sort of baby bird into your home. You cannot take it into your garage. You cannot do anything like that and care for it. So when it comes to, you know, interfering, if that bird is hurt, it is really highly recommended that you try and bring it to somewhere that is licensed to take care of that bird. As we know, birds in general are in heavy decline. About almost 3 billion birds per year are lost just from things like cats being let outdoors. So any sort of help that we can provide these birds, I think, is super important. And so, you know, if you do find a baby bird or any sort of injured bird, it doesn't have to be a baby, any sort of injured bird or any sort of injured animal, for that case, finding your local wildlife rehabilitator, I think, is super important. I have made a whole other separate video on this that you guys can go refer to, and maybe Richard can put that as a link in the comments or something like that. Otherwise, it's very accessible through our Facebook and our other forms of social media. But in that video, I really go into depth on what to do if you find an injured bird or a baby bird, how to transport it properly. But for the most part, the key takeaways are, if you find an injured bird, make sure to not feed it. Don't give it any sort of food. Don't give it any sort of water. These birds, oftentimes, you know, it takes a very trained eye and a trained professional to be able to give fluids or feed any sort of bird. And so you're oftentimes doing a lot more harm than good. And that bird is going to be fine without food or water for X amount of time while you transport it to your rehabber. If you guys do live in the lower 48 states, you can go on, sorry, I'm trying to find my coffee. You guys can go on your Department of Natural Resources website, and this basically is going to allow you to see all of your licensed wildlife rehabbers county by county, and just lists what they are licensed to treat, and also their phone numbers and where they are located. And if you do live in it's somewhere that is a little bit more rural, you might have to drive a little bit, but the alternative is that animal doesn't get help. And so if you can do it, if you can spare the time, then I really highly recommend. But overall, transporting it, just keep it away from any loud noises, any pets, things like that. Put it in a nice box that is covered up. So cover it with a blanket or a towel or something like that. Again, no food or water, and then transport it to your local wildlife rehabber. And if you do have trouble reaching somebody, you can always call us here at the Raptor Center. I know that I have given out quite a bit of advice over the phone of people not even located in Alaska, because they know that this is what we do and this is, what our job is. So if you do just need us to answer a question, if we're available, we are more than happy to sit down and talk with you. Wintertime is especially a good time to talk because we don't have the abundance of, tourists here and things on the island like we do in the summer. But for the most part, we are happy to give you that advice. If you need anything, just give us a call and we can walk you through on if that bird even needs to be helped. Because there are a lot of times that you see in rehab where people will bring in baby birds that don't actually need to be rescued at all, that, they're fledging and they're supposed to be down on the ground. And but people, kind of mistake that. So if there are any sort of questions, just make sure to give us a call and we can let you know. All right. The third myth, feeding birds bread. This one is a very old myth from what I have been looking into. It seems like the first recorded stories of people feeding birds for pleasure came from the 6th century with a monk named Saint Cerf. And there are these first original written documentation of him going out and feeding the birds simply because he enjoyed it. And so that's where we first see the stories of going out and feeding birds. I could not particularly find where the idea of feeding birds bread came from. I think back, from the people that I've talked to, it seems as though it used to be seen as sort of like an environmentally conscious thing to do, where you have this old stale bread, you don't want to throw it away, put it in the landfill, so let's go ahead and go to the park and feed the birds the bread. So when it comes to feeding wildlife, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit with another myth, but when it comes to feeding wildlife, you have to do it properly. And one of the biggest things that we need to be doing is just helping reduce the risk associated with feeding wildlife. In general, feeding birds bread is a big no-no. Please don't do it. Not only is it, well, I'll kind of go into why it is you don't want to feed birds bread in general, but for the most part, birds, they need quite a bit of nutrients. They need proteins, they need fats, they need carbohydrates to make sure that they're maintaining a healthy diet. And the problem with bread is it lacks that nutritional nutrition. It's super, super high in carbohydrates and sugar. And so what happens is you feed these birds the bread, it fills them up, and they're like, great, I don't need to eat anymore. And then unfortunately, they're just full of the carbs and the sugar, and it can lead to different feather deformities and also bone deformities. It's called angel wing. You guys might have, I'm hoping you've never had to see this in person, but it's unfortunately something that we do see in rehab with wildlife and with waterfowl in particular, because again, it is so popular to go out and to feed at your local pond, the waterfowl, the birds and things that are there. And so what happens is years and years, these birds are being fed this very, very poor nutritional diet of bread. And again, it leads to angel wing, which I think I have a picture of here. Let me get this out. Which essentially, over time, it can deform the wing joints, or excuse me, the right here. There we go. That seems to be a pretty good picture. So what it does is it essentially deforms the wrist joints of these birds' wings. And so it kind of flares out their wings, and it makes them unable to hold their wings flush to their bodies. And it almost gives their feathers a stick-like appearance. And when we see birds come in with angel wing deformity when they're already mature adults, it can really almost a lot of times it can be fatal, because getting that bird back to where it needs to be is almost impossible. It's incredibly difficult. And if it's not as far gone as something like that picture was, you do see some pretty major feather damage in general. And feathers, you know, obviously they need their feathers, their primaries and secondaries on their wings. They need those to be able to fly properly. And so I really do recommend, if you do want to go out and feed your waterfowl at the local pond or whatever it may be, bringing a variety of really nutritionally dense options. So that can look like wheat, barley, just different seeds, grains. You can add in some veggies or even some fruit, just, you know, a little bit in moderation, of course. And this way they're eating something that is it's a lot more nutritionally dense than just, you know, white bread or bread in general. So we will go ahead and move on to the next myth. All right, myth number 4, and this one kind of goes off of what I was just talking about before with feeding the birds bread. Feeding wild birds will make them dependent on you or make them not migrate. So this one is really tricky. And like I said before, it is very debated. There are some people out there that say, do not feed any sort of wildlife, any sort of food, or do it this way, X, Y, and Z. So when my personal experience and my personal research, and of course regarding what Alaska Fish and Wildlife says, which is, humans, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we're a part of nature. We are going to be affecting these birds either way. And so how can we put these birds and different wildlife at the forefront of our minds to be able to do it correctly? So when we think about feeding wild birds, and when I say that, I more so mean in your backyards. You have your backyard bird feeders and things like that. You really need to take in 3 major risks that these birds are facing when they come to your feeders. And if you can reduce some of those risks as best as you can, then I think that feeding your birds in your backyard, with your bird feeders is completely fine. But again, just making sure that those risks are at the forefront of our minds to reduce as much danger to these birds as possible, I think is super important. So the 3 major risks that I like to look at would be disease, predation, and collision. So when it comes to birds feeding at your backyard feeder, generally we look at songbirds as being foragers. They're opportunistic foragers. So overall, we see studies show that your backyard bird feeder is only going to be making up less than about 30% of that bird's diet. And so in general, they're not fully relying on that bird seed for its entire diet. They're going out and they're foraging for other foods that make up their diet. That being said, again, doing it correctly is important. So when we talk about reducing these risks for disease in particular, keeping those feeders clean is super, super important, especially right now during one of the largest outbreaks of avian influenza that we've ever seen. It's an incredibly infectious strain, and we are seeing a massive amount of birds being affected all over the world, not just in the US, but all over the world. And even when we don't have these major pandemics happening, or not pandemics, but I'm trying to think of the word. Either way, even if we don't have these major things, disease outbreaks happening, we want to make sure that we're keeping our feeders clean. And so what that looks like is making a 10% bleach solution and making sure to keep them nice and clean. I think it's recommended from the CDC and also the US Fish and Wildlife, cleaning your feeder every 2 to 3 weeks with soap and water and a 10% bleach solution. And this is to make sure that we're keeping these really bad diseases at bay. So things like avian pox, conjunctivitis, which is particularly bad in finches and house finches at feeders. We see that pretty commonly. And things like salmonella as well. So keeping that feeder clean and also trying to avoid overcrowding as well. So having more than one feeder is super important. And that way, again, you're kind of dispersing it out. Making sure to sweep up any old moldy seed that falls to the bottom onto the ground. Again, just to make sure you're cleaning up any sort of bacteria. just to avoid any sort of illness spread through the bird populations. When it comes to collision, we think collision as in a lot of times you see birds hitting windows because they come in for the bird feeders, and you have these ginormous windows on the different houses, and they run into it, and they can, depends on how bad the collision is, but we do see quite a bit of window collisions here at the center. And so in order to help reduce that, you want to make sure you are moving your feeders about 15 to 30 feet away from your windows. And then if you can also put up any sort of decals by your feeders as well, to basically break up that silhouette of the window. Because what happens is these birds are flying, and all they see is a reflection of the trees and the sky in your window, and they think, oh, of course, I can go through that. But in reality, it's a window, they strike it, and that is a big issue when it comes to birds being injured and coming into rehab, is window collisions. So trying to move those feeders away about 15 to 30 feet is recommended. Predation, the third major risk that we want to help reduce when feeding our backyard birds is going to be predation. So if you have any sort of cat problem in your neighborhood, if you let your cat outdoors, just don't even put the feeders out there, because what happens is unfortunately we see cats, domestic cats, they kill about, like I said previously, they kill about 2.5 billion birds per year in the United States and in Canada. It is one of the leading causes of bird deaths from the human side, so human-related bird deaths in the United States and again in Canada. And so if you do have any sort of cat problem in your neighborhood, I recommend just trying to engage with nature and with your local bird populations in another way. Going to your local nature observatory or something like that to kind of, again, get engaged, but try to avoid any sort of backyard bird feeding, just because, again, those cats, they will predate upon those birds and unfortunately lead to some pretty massive bird loss in the US and in Canada. So we recommend to kind of stay away from that. Overall, when it comes to, these birds and their migration patterns being affected, again, not only does it make up, less than 30% of their population, if you're doing that in conjunction with all of these things that I mentioned to help reduce the risks, we have seen there are some studies out there that show it can kind of shift migration patterns for some species of birds, particularly more north, but that's a whole other thing I could get into. But for the most part, making sure to, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. In terms of not letting them migrate, birds migrate for a whole lot of other reasons. There's a lot of intrinsic reasons that these birds are migrating, whether that be day length. There are things like just bad weather, food availability, and genetic instincts that are making these birds want to migrate. So it's not just the food availability itself that is playing a part into this. And so, if you can help those birds, fatten up their fat reserves before migrating, then I think that's really great. Again, taking into account all of these other risks and making sure to do the best possible by the bird. Because again, overall, there are some people out there that say don't interfere with nature, and in reality we are part of nature, and to say that we're not, I think, is a little misguided. So what we can do to, again, mitigate those risks, I think is needs to be at the forefront of our minds to do it in the correct way. All right, after that tangent, we will go on to the next myth. I have just as a little note here, I do have 7 myths, and we are on number 5. So hopefully, if you guys are still, okay, awesome. Looks like we got a few people tuning in. That's awesome. Okay, so myth number 5, owls can turn their heads 360 degrees. So if any of you guys have been watching our little tidbit videos on our social media, or if you've had the pleasure of visiting us here at the center in Alaska, then you probably have already learned that this is not true. So I think originally when I tried to find where this myth even came from, I think it's simply because when you look at an owl, it does indeed look like they can turn their head 360 degrees. But in fact, they cannot. They can only turn their heads about 270 degrees. And there's a few different reasons for this. So the first major reason is they literally cannot move their eyes from side to side without needing to move their head. So for the most part, when you think of human eyes versus owl eyes, they are very, very different. Not only are they huge for the actual size of their skull, but they're actually set in place in a bony ring structure called sclerotic rings. And what this does is, again, it fixes the actual eye in place. And so in order for that owl to be able to look around, it has to turn its head. Unlike a human, like me, I can keep my head still and I can move my eyes from left to right or up and down without an issue. But when it comes to owls, they need to be able to move their heads, and that's where that 270 degrees comes in handy, because of course these birds, they are apex predators, but they have to be on alert at all times. And they do this by having 14 cervical vertebrae, which is really interesting. So humans, we have 7, and that's why I can only turn my head that much. But when it comes to owls, they have 14, so that kind of helps them be able to turn their heads 270 degrees. All right, myth number 6. This one I found to be really interesting, and it wasn't one that I had heard ever in my life until I came to Alaska and I was engaging with a lot of tourists. I did not know that this was a misconception when it comes to birds, but people are very passionate about it, and this is one that we actually hear quite a bit. So I have been asked several times if it is true if bald eagles will shed their beaks and talons every so often to be able to maintain a long lifespan. And when I first was asked this, I just was like, I just really didn't know how to respond to it because I had never heard of it. And so, of course, I just went into why it's not true. But for the most part, when I was doing some research and also asking some other of my coworkers, where did this myth come from? It seems like back in the day in the early 2000s, really long time ago, there was a presentation or a story that came out, and it was basically, let me see what it was called. It was like the birth of an eagle, I think it was called. And in this story, it basically said that bald eagles can live up to 70 years old, but in order to live this really long life, they need to be able to shed their beak and their talons to, oops, sorry. We got some cords dropping over there. So in order to be able to live to these long lifespans, they need to shed their beak and their talons, because over time they deteriorate and they get floppy and they just don't maintain the rigidity over the years. So that is completely not true. It also had mentioned that they go into like a mountainous cave and they bang their beak on a rock, over however long, and that beak breaks off. But again, that is not true. The beak and the talons of bald eagles and birds in general, they're made of a hard keratin. So just like our fingernails, they're relatively similar, but just like our fingernails, they are continuously growing, and their beaks and their talons have several layers of very rigid, hard keratin. And so they're continuously growing and they're continuously being sharpened and shortened on different substrates. So rocks, tree bark, whatever it may be, they're continuously getting shortened and sharpened. And these birds need to be able to have, bald eagles in particular, they need to be able to have these really strong talons, because that is the number one thing that they're using to catch their prey, whether it be a salmon or whatever it is that they're hunting in that moment. They need to rely on their really strong talons, and their beak is something that they use as a tool. It is shaped with that curve, nice curve, to be able to scoop out prey, the pieces of the prey that it's eating. And so I found this to be a really interesting myth, but again, it's not true. They continuously, again, sharpen and shorten their beak throughout their lifetime. Also, bald eagles do not live into their 70s. The oldest recorded bald eagle in captivity was 52 years old. So that is absolutely a really old eagle. We had our oldest living resident here. His name was Volta. He was 37, at least 37. And so they can definitely get up there in age. But for the most part, in the wild, we typically see bald eagles live to about mid-20s. And then in captivity, you can double that number or so, because of course there's a lot of reasons that go into that. But I thought this one was really interesting, and it wasn't one that I was familiar with until I did some research about this whole presentation that came out that people were basically taking as fact, but it is not true. So if you hear anybody say that to you, you can tell them why that is not true. All right, the final myth, and I liked this one because we just passed Valentine's Day. Bald eagles mate for life. So this one is technically sort of true. They are technically monogamous birds. And I say that because for the most part, it is dependent on a few different things. Obviously, when it comes to wildlife in general, the number one thing that they are, that we exist for is survival of their offspring and to reproduce and continue on generations. And so bald eagles, when they do find a mate through a very interesting little mating ritual, it's called the death spiral, which also needs to be studied a little bit more. But for the most part, they go like 2 to 3 miles up in the air. They clasp their talons together and they free fall. And if the female, says, okay, this male is who I want, it seems to have strong genetics, and I think it can produce viable offspring for me, they will go ahead and they will build a nest, and they will continuously do so. Every single breeding year, they will come together again in that same nest location, and they will meet their mate again. They don't spend all year together. They will again go separate ways after their nest is completed and their offspring have left the nest at about 12 weeks of age. But for the most part, if they aren't producing viable offspring, aka if their eaglets aren't being raised to maturity and successfully, or if that mate dies, they will absolutely find another mate. So they're more so loyal to the nest site rather than they are to the mate itself. Because again, the number one objective is to raise some nice, strong offspring. All right. So for the most part, I know I kind of chatted quite a bit, but I think we're going to go ahead and open it up to some questions. Richard, I think, is going to read off some things. For the most part, we are a 501(c) nonprofit. I have to mention that we do rely very heavily on donations. We are not government funded or anything like that. So if you guys have some time to donate to our organization, that would be absolutely wonderful. It'll help me keep doing these live streams and help us keep saving our local bird populations. But I think we'll switch over to some questions.
I'm going to try to do something real quick.
Okay.
All right, we're able to do it there.
Oh, great. Hi, everybody.
I'm just going to step past you real quick to try to do the other camera.
How's everybody's Saturday going? Hello. I'm reading some of the comments. Tom says that he has also heard the shedding the beak and the talons. Yeah. I was very surprised, but then when I was talking to my coworkers, they had mentioned that that is something that they actually hear all the time. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to start asking them. I can kind of go through here and pick out some of the ones that would be a good topic to discuss.
And you may have answered all the questions.
I might have, yeah. You guys are telling me you just listened to that really interesting presentation and you don't have any questions? Eagles mate for life for the most part unless they lose their mate or the current mate can't produce offspring. That is right, Tom. Good to know they're listening out there.
You had someone earlier, I didn't see it in the past comments, I think it was on TikTok, that asked, is it actually illegal to have a bald eagle as a pet?
Is it actually illegal to have a bald eagle as a pet? Absolutely. It 100% is. So way back at the very beginning of my presentation, I talked about the protective legislation that is in place to protect our world's bird species. So we have, when it comes to bald eagles, you guys know, or you might not know, that bald eagles were almost once extinct. Back in the 70s, they had to be placed on the endangered species list because we had less than 500 breeding pair all across North America. That's like 1,000 bald eagles left. That's insane. Those numbers were so low. They were so close to extinction. But with the banning of the chemical DDT, along with the Migratory Bird Act, the Lacey Act, and the Bald Eagle Act, we were able to get those numbers back up, of course, like in places like us existing and other restoration acts. But for the most part, with that, they had to put in these pieces of legislation that protected eagles against hunting. And so for the most part, if you are caught even with a bald eagle feather, it is considered a felony. It's like a $200,000 fine. And it's a massive headache, to be honest with you. So in terms of having a bald eagle as a pet, absolutely that is illegal. You know, there are falconers out there that use trained birds of prey to hunt. Bald eagles are not a falconry bird, generally speaking. There's an old practice where golden eagles are used for falconry, but for the most part, it is heavily illegal. And you also don't want them as pets. They are very, they are an apex predator and do not make good pets. I have a bite on my finger. One of them bit me the other day. Okay. Let's see. Have any of the handlers, or excuse me, have any of the eagles tried to attack the handlers? That's funny. I just mentioned that. For the most part, when it comes to, we work with two different types of eagles, right? We work with our rehab eagles, the bald eagles that come in that are very, very, very wild and have no human contact, and rehab is a relatively traumatic process for them, right? They're getting poked and they're getting prodded and they don't understand that we're trying to help them. And so, yeah, their main defense is to try and protect themselves. That is their number one instinct, just like you or I would do the same. And so we definitely have to be very careful when handling our eagles, the rehab eagles that come in, because their talons are their number one weapon. They have an incredible amount of force in each one of their feet. It's like 2,000 pounds of pressure, PSI per foot, and those feet can do a lot of damage. And in terms of our raptors in residence, our eagles that are glove trained or have been here for quite a few years, you know, it depends on the eagle itself, because I think all eagles, all of our raptor and resident eagles, all of our permanent resident eagles, they have different personalities. So one of them bit me the other day because I was fiddling around too much with their equipment, and she didn't like that. I've had one of our eagles bite me in the face a few times because she was also getting frustrated with me. And so it's always the handler's fault, because it's my responsibility to be reading that bird's body language and understanding what it's trying to communicate to me via body language. And I wasn't paying attention in that moment, and she let me know, and it hurts, but you learn from it.
So we had someone ask this, which is also, we commonly hear the darker ones being females, if you want to cover that real quick.
Oh, sure, yeah. So at what age are bald eagles mature enough to mate? So we typically see a lot of, like Richard had just mentioned, some questions regarding this in terms of females versus males and sexual dimorphism. So when I look at a male and a female, can I tell based on feather color or size or whatever it may be? So in terms of what age are they mature enough to mate, they are sexually mature at age 5, and that is when they get their full white head, full white tail, and full yellow beak. There is a myth out there that the females are the darker, like kind of chocolate colored ones, kind of look like golden eagles, but those are actually just juvenile bald eagles, and it's really, really hard to tell the males from the eagles. We typically just see the weight difference is the number one indicator. So the females are heavier than the males. Leading theory is that they do the majority of the incubating the eggs, so it makes sense that they have to be a little bit heavier, but for the most part, 5 years old. Do you get many cases of lead poisoning there? I was a volunteer at a rehab in VA, Virginia, and get lead poisoned eagles here. Yes, absolutely we do. So we do see, we haven't had any this past year or the year prior. But we do absolutely see lead poisoning. Obviously, we try and advocate for non-lead ammunition, non-lead fishing lures, things like that. But it can be difficult because lead is usually the cheaper of the options. So we ask people to maybe use copper or something like that. But of course, there's a lot of things that go into whether or not a family is able to switch to the more expensive option. But we do see lead poisoning, and it's something that is hard because it's extremely taxing on the bird to get them through it. And they're here for a very long time. So we absolutely do see lead poisoning, especially in Alaska, because there's a lot of subsistence hunting where hunting is a lifestyle here. But I am very blessed to say that I think I live in an area where the locals are very, very in tune with nature, and they do a very good job when it comes to trying to be as much in balance with the nature around them as possible, which is, I think, phenomenal. All right. Okay, let's see. Any other questions? It says Tom Sawyer Eagle Pros answering a lot of questions. That's funny. I want to live in Alaska someday. It's cool. You should come over here. Okay. Oh, just one more quick one. Apologies if you addressed this already. Many people will think that baby birds will be rejected by their mothers if a human touches them. This isn't true. That is correct. The cat's pajamas. That's definitely not true. The birds, they will, the mom or the dad, they might reject if that bird is, if that baby bird is sick. Sometimes you can't see the illness, but for the most part, that is not true. A lot of people say it's because they can smell the human on them, but in reality, most bird species do not really have much of an olfactory sense at all. And so you don't have to worry about that. We recommend making sure to, if you find the nest and it's intact, put that baby bird back in there. If you guys want to donate, again, visit us at AlaskaRaptor.org. We would love to hear from you if you have any other further questions. Again, we are a 501(c) nonprofit, so we really do heavily rely on donations and people coming to visit us. If you have any suggestions for further live streams in the future, please let me know. I'd love to hear your suggestions on that. Otherwise, I think we are pretty much done. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. It looks like we have a few viewers still, so that's awesome. Thank you for listening to me and all of my ranting when it comes to birds. Let's see here. Awesome. Okay, thank you guys so much.